Morphological processes define different types of words. For example, words that involve processes that are fully productive, or words that are generated by means of more or less exceptional processes. In the following, we will first look at types, the main types of morphological process. We'll then exemplify each main process in particular, and eventually look at the main criteria that keep these processes apart. So let's start with an overview. Here are the main morphological processes. The central subdivision is between inflection and word formation. Now, in inflection, and this is the formal definition, we normally have one base form and one operation that can be applied to this base form. Word formation processes involve a base form that is modified either by a morphological operation, or you have a process where you simply concatenate one base form with several other base forms. Now, the subdivision, the formal subdivision between the main types, derivation on the one hand and compounding on the other, is as follows. In derivation, we do exactly the same as we did in inflection. We have one base form and one operation that modifies the base somehow. As you would see, sometimes we have in inflection as well as in derivation the possibility of applying two or even more operations at the same time. And in compounding, we formally or compounding is formally defined as a combination of one base, which you might in this case also call lexeme, plus n base forms that are added to this base form. So this is the formal definition of the main types of morphological process. Let's now look at them in more detail, and first of all look at some examples and some general information about these processes. Now, inflection is often, as you may have found in the literature, spelled alternatively inflection, and it is normally subdivided into two types, and that has historical reasons. One type is called declension. It is the inflection or the inflectional process applied to nominal categories such as noun, adjective, and determiner. And the other type of inflection is often referred to as conjugation, and the main category that is involved here is the verb. Let's look at some examples. Now, here we have a typical example of inflection, walk plus the morph ed. I'm using orthographical notation here for reasons of simplification. Now, here we have a concatenative operation where you add a suffix to a base form. In the example mouse, which becomes mice, we don't have a concatenative operation, but a vocalic change, one particular type of non-concatenative operations. And in go, which might become went, we have an example of suppletion. Now, the set of inflectional variants associated with one base form is called the paradigm. Let's look at some paradigms in more detail. This little tool here allows us to select a number of base forms and see how many elements the paradigm will eventually contain. So here we have love, and you see the base form love can be associated with 4 inflectional variants. So the paradigm is relatively small. If we compare that with the German equivalent of love, lieb, liebe, liebst, liebt, etc., we will see that the paradigm is much larger. An even larger paradigm is represented by the equivalent in Latin ama, amo, ama is the basic form, amas, amat, amamos, etc. And you see the paradigm is even larger. The maximum number of elements in a verbal paradigm in present-day English is 5, as you can see in this paradigm of the base form take. Now, typical example of derivation are things like act, active, where you have the operation of concatenation again. You add an affix, here a suffix. Or you might have things like destroy, which becomes destruction. And here, of course, you have, sorry, I should have inserted a boundary. Destroy, destruction. And here, of course, you have several operations that are active at the same time. On the one hand, we have affixation, or a concatenative operation. Then we have a vocalic change, where oi changes into a. And at the same time, we have the insertion of a particular consonant, destroy, receives a k at the end, destruction. So we have several morphological operations that are active in this particular derivative. The set of elements that constitutes the possible derivatives of one base form is called a word family. Now, in compounding, also sometimes referred to as composition, we have a word formation process that involves at least 2 base forms or 2 lexemes. So we could have something like bath and then add room to it. Now we have a compound bathroom. Now this compound can serve as an input to the next step of compounding by adding bathroom, or by generating the next larger compound bathroom towel. Note that I'm inserting morph boundaries here, that in order to avoid the spelling problems, whether a compound is spelled with a hyphen, in a spaced form, or in a solid form. And we could go on. We could use this as an input to our next compound, bathroom, towel, and then we could add designer. And here you see something very interesting. Now, compounds, of course, can undergo further morphological processes. For example, here we have design plus ER, a derivative, and we can even add an inflectional morph at the end to turn it into bathroom towel designers. Now, since formally it is easy to separate compounds from inflectional processes and derivational processes, compounds involve at least 2 base forms. We have to look at derivation and inflection in more detail and have to find out some criteria which keep these particular processes apart. Now, the first of these criteria is productivity. Productivity means, or wants to answer the question whether a process applies to all members of a given class or only to some of them. Inflection is fully productive, since all members of a specific class, let's say all verbs, can undergo a certain inflectional process. So let's take, for example, past tense. Let's take blue here. So if this is the morpheme for past tense, then we can simply say this morpheme can be applied to all verbal base forms. All verbal base forms have a past tense form, irrespective of the morphological operation that is involved. If by contrast we look at the, let's say, the affix eyes, which turns a noun into a verb, standardize, we run into trouble if we take other nouns like lizard. Lizardize, well, that is hardly possible. So standardize works, but lizardize does not work. The next criterion concerns the stability of the word class. Well, in inflection, the word class is not changed. So if we take something like take and taken, well, in both cases, we have a verb. Whereas in derivational processes, if we take standard and standardize, we immediately see we have a noun here, but the whole thing becomes a verb. We have to be careful, though. The word class does not necessarily have to change, but it may change in derivational processes. In inflectional processes, the word class never changes at all. The next criterion concerns the stress pattern, whereas in inflectional processes, so if you take something like take and taking, the stress always remains the same, so it's in both cases on the first syllable. Derivational processes may change the stress pattern, but again, we have to be careful. This does not mean that all derivational processes involve a change of stress pattern, but some of them. So if you compare standardize and standardization, well, then you immediately see that in standardize, the stress would have been on the first syllable, but in standardization, the stress shifts towards the end of the new derivative. The final criterion that keeps derivation and inflection apart is called semantic transparency. Here we simply wrote down the word meaning. Now, whereas inflection is semantically fully transparent, derivation is not always. So if we add our past tense morpheme ed, we know that the verb, the resulting verb, is always in the past. So the meaning is the past of a particular verb. If we add, by contrast, ion to a base form and get a new derivative, we might normally expect that ion means the act of what the verb describes. So standardization is the act of standardizing. But what about a word like commission? Now, commission is certainly not the act of committing, or television is not the act of televising anymore. These criteria are primarily based on present-day English. In some languages, the criterion stability of stress pattern, for example, does not work. Here is an example from Welsh, a Celtic language. In Welsh, aval means apple, and the plural
Afalau.
is
Afalau.
So you see, even in inflectional processes in some languages, the stress may change. So let's summarize. Formally, a distinction can be drawn between inflection, so this is inflection, this is derivation, on the one hand, and compounding on the other. One base form, several base forms. In order to distinguish inflection and derivation, we need further criteria In the literature, the terms morphological processes and morphological operations have not been used in a uniform way. Some linguists even contradict each other. In the terminology of the virtual linguistics campus, however, these two aspects of morphology have been kept apart very strictly. Morphological operations, as you can see here, morphological operations define how words can be modified, for example, by the addition of new material, by the change of existing material. This unit outlines the central operations using present-day English and some other languages as examples. Let's first of all look at some types of morphological operation in general. To build words, morphological operations have to manipulate base forms in various ways. This can be done by means of adding material, concatenating material, adding material. Two or more entities can be added. It can be achieved by non-concatenative operations, in which case the base is somehow modified, and it can be done in terms of further operations that range from more complicated concatenative operations or others, or to the subtraction of material from the base. Let's start with concatenative operations. Well, as you can see here on top, there's the term affix, first of all, because many people associate concatenative operations with affixation. And this is the simplest and most direct means, perhaps, by which a language can mark a category in terms of grammatical properties. The material that is added is referred to as an affix. The operation is called affixation. Depending on their position in relationship to the base, affixes can be called prefixes, and the operation would be prefixation. So let's write down some examples here. For example, in present-day English, we have something like misleads. I'm now using orthography, even though everyone knows that it is pretty clear that morphological analysis has to be carried out in terms of phonology. But this is the simpler procedure here. So this would be a prefix. A next possibility would be an infix. The process would be, the operation would be called infixation. Now, infixation is hardly used in English. Well, if it is used in highly expressive language. For example, you could invent or make up the word kangaroo and insert, as I said, in an expressive way, kanga bloody roo. Well, what a word this is. This would be an infix because it is inserted into the base. Another one would be suffixation. This is another operation where we add material to the base. Now, suffixes typically occur in present-day English again. Kindly, this would be a suffix that turns an adjective into an adverb, or inflectional suffixes like walks. So here something is added towards the end. And finally, we have circumfixes. Now, circumfixes do not exist in present-day English, but here's an example from German, my mother tongue, which expresses a verb. Now, the base form of the verb is leg, which is the base form of the verb to put something somewhere. And this circumfix then expresses the past participle of this verb. So these are concatenative operations, as I said, the most important ones, affixation. Now let's look at some non-concatenative operations. Well, they show us that the picture of words consisting of a string of morphs is too simple. across languages. Besides affixation, there are quite a few other formal operations by which complex word forms can be derived. These operations, in summary, are called non-concatenative operations, since the resulting word cannot easily be segmented into morphs. Let's first of all look at vocalic changes. Now, vocalic changes are well known. This is an important type of base modification where the vowel of the base is changed. Often this is referred to as vowel alternation. Well, two types of vowel change can be found in present-day English or in other languages. The first one is the so-called ablaut, where the vowel of the base form is changed. In English, we have verbs like drink, and the past tense form is drank. Now, this is a typical vocalic change where the E is changed into A. By the way, the same can be used for German, where we have ich trinke, I drink, versus ich trank. So this is an ablaut. Other changes which we do not want to exemplify here is the so-called umlaut, which in English cannot be found anymore, at least not in the synchronical analysis of English as it stands now. But in the past, in Old English, there were many cases of umlaut. Let's now look at another change, the tonal change. Now, this is quite interesting. However, we need a native speaker here, and I introduce Mao Mao from China, whose mother tongue obviously is Mandarin Chinese, and she will illustrate to us now tonal changes by, first of all, writing down one word in 4 different characters. Okay, go ahead, please. So, first of all, the Chinese characters, and then later Mao Mao will pronounce these words and will also tell us what they mean. And tonal changes, of course, are used in languages such as Chinese or Vietnamese, languages where the syllables are associated with particular tones. Now here we see the wonderful logographic script. Perfect writing. I will never understand how Chinese speakers can cope with this complicated writing system. Okay, now first of all, tell us what they mean, these words. What is the first word?
Mother.
Mother. Okay, let's write down these words. Mother. The next one is hemp. And then we have horse. Okay. And curse. Oh, okay, curse. Okay, so these are the meanings. Now we need the Chinese pronunciations, and we have to write that down phonologically. So can you pronounce them to us?
This one is ma.
Ma. And I can identify a level tone here.
Yep. Second one is ma.
Ah, that was a nice rising tone.
And third one is ma.
That's the one where we have most trouble. That was a fall rise, wasn't it?
Yes.
Okay, fall rise.
And last one is ma.
Ah, that was a very significant fall. So let me repeat that. Ma, 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 ma.
Ma, ma.
Oh, well, this is difficult anyway, but you can see here the problem of the tonal analysis. In fact, one of the most well-known non-concatenative operations in morphology. Now, let's look at another operation, stress change. Now we know that in present-day English, for example, we can distinguish words by shifting the stress. For example, if we stress the first syllable in this word, then it is a noun. Contrast. If we stress the second syllable in this word, contrast, it becomes a verb. And we have similar phenomena in my mother tongue, in German, where, for example, you have a word like, let me first of all spell it before I pronounce it. Übersetzen if I stress the second syllable, then the meaning is translate. So here we have a meaning change. And if I stress the first syllable, übersetzen, then it means something like carry over. So stress shift determines the meaning. In some German examples, it determines the word class, can determine the word class in selected examples in present-day English. Now let's look at some further operations. Well, a well-known operation which can be found across languages is reduplication. In fact, we can find this operation where part or all of the affected base, perhaps modified in some systematic fashion, is copied. English makes use of this very sporadically. You can see examples here, like in hurly-burly or 50-50, sing-song, helter-skelter, or honky-tonky. So these are typical examples that are used. Children use this very often in words like yummy, yummy, when something tastes very nice. So that is reduplication. However, reduplication can also be used in other languages to mark inflectional categories. Let's look at an example. So here is an example from the VLC language index, a large database with sound information about the languages of the world. And here we have Indonesian. I just picked one speaker out of our 15 speakers which are represented on the VLC. And here you find the pattern which signals book, books, big book, the very big book, in the book, on the book, and so on. And you see the singular in Indonesian is
buku, buku,
buku. And the plural,
buku, buku,
buku, buku. Again.
buku, buku.
So you see reduplication, full reduplication, you simply use the same base form twice to signal the plural in Indonesian. Finally, we have an operation which is called suppletion. This is perhaps the most extreme form of base modification. It concerns the complete replacement of one base by another. This is most frequently encountered in the close classes of grammar, pronouns, copula, and here even, so copula would be something like be, is, am, where it is very hard, if not impossible, to see relationships between these items which belong to the same paradigm. Or the example go and went, where really it is impossible to relate went as the past tense form of go morphologically to its base. So suppletion is thus a morphological operation that expresses no systematic similarity between the forms of a paradigm. Let's summarize. Morphological operations define how words can be modified. In other words, what type of operation is applied to change a word. Morphological processes that have not been dealt with here, they define different ways of building words. The two principal ones are inflection and word formation, but they will be discussed in another unit of the Virtual Linguistics campus.